Many men marveled at the sheer bravery or ignorance of Washington, standing time and time again in the line of fire as cannonade erupted all around him. While surveying the trenches, a cannonball landed very near to Washington, and a deafening thunderclap of light and noise as it erupted among its officers. Hey guys, I'm Tommy Dimsdale with the National Association for Gun Rights, and welcome to yet another History Hour production. Today we are focusing on the miracle at Yorktown. The story of Yorktown is truly amazing, and the writings of those involved claim that the divine hand of Providence was what secured victory for them. Thanks to extraordinary timing and unfathomable circumstances, General George Washington was able to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat and take Yorktown, putting an end to the 6-year war for independence. Please don't forget to like and subscribe down below, and let us know if you want to hear any more history episodes on our channel. Once again, you'll be hearing an excerpt from my book, A Call to Arms. This is fantastic for the young and the old alike. I've had parents whose kids were about to go to college come back to me and tell me that their kids can't get enough of learning about history since reading this book. So if you want a copy, the link is in the description below. But for now, let's jump into the Battle of Yorktown. So for the last year, war had been raging in the South, and thanks to the Patriot at Kings Mountain and Cowpens, Cornwallis abandoned his goals of victory in the Southern campaign and decided to flee to Yorktown, where he could rest from his frustrating setbacks in South Carolina. Meanwhile, the Americans were making plans and would soon carry them out to devastating effect. Washington was surveying the rolling plains of New York through his spyglass, planning his next move. Neither the general nor his nearby French aide, French General Rochambeau, could have ever guessed that these rolling hills would one day be a bustling metropolis of commuters and workers carrying out the American dream from day to day. The situation at hand was much more dire. The lands of New York stood not yet as an example of American ingenuity and capitalism, but as a pitted battleground, still stained from the blood of Washington's earlier defeats during the beginning of the war for independence. Now, 6 years later, the general weighed his options heavily. He could feel the war coming to an end. Both sides were bloodied and bruised, but back in England, the struggle had grown unpopular and costly. The patience of the English people waned, as did the provisions and the morale of the Continental Army. In striking New York, the rebels could cause just enough of a stalemate to begin peace talks, but perhaps not a decisive blow that would force British surrender. "New York Harbor," Washington said under his breath. The general beckoned towards his French ally. "Should we strike decisively and quick, perhaps we can put an end to this skirmish." Rochambeau strode alongside his commander, taking in the layout of the port town. "Cornwallis has fled south. He resides in Yorktown. Should we capture his force, it should be a most swift and final movement needed for our forces. A siege of sorts could end this war." Washington lowered his spyglass, inquisitively glancing at the Frenchman. "Yorktown is already heavily fortified. Cornwallis enjoys the luxury of a British navy at his back. What would you have? That we lay siege to the town while Cornwallis relaxes among brothels in his company as the sea resupplies his every need? No, I cannot spare the men to make the march and brave such a risk with no real reward." The Frenchman had encouraged Washington often enough to turn the troops towards Yorktown that the grizzled veteran began to feel a tinge of annoyance at the suggestion. However, listening to the counsel of his advisors was always a strong suit for Washington. Unlike the top-down, heavy-handed method used by European armies, the Continental Army utilized much input from lower ranks, sometimes resulting in wiser choices, which has evolved into what we now know as decentralized command. However, it was a known fact that the capture of Yorktown served no purpose as long as Cornwallis utilized his navy to indefinitely resupply his troops. "Sir, what if we had a navy ourselves?" Washington stared back, cautiously hiding any excitement at the idea. Rochambeau, who had been in communication with King Louis XVI, produced a letter from his pocket branded with the royal French seal. "My good sir," he said, handing over the message, "Comte de Grasse sends word of his departure from the West Indies. He boasts 25 warships, 3,000 men." Washington quickly rounds up his top commanders together to unveil his plan of misinformation and deception, a trait that Washington was very skilled at. That evening, he directed his officers that the troops camped in the wilderness were not to be alerted as to where they were going, and specific pockets of misguided information would be spread to known British spies. Washington also ordered the French to set up camps and cooking boilers to feed several thousand men and place it on the outskirts of the White Plains over New York. The guise that an impending attack on New York would soon take place left the British wasting valuable resources to further fortify the city. The general looked towards his officers. Having been betrayed by loose tongues in the past, perhaps we can use loose tongues to help us now. During the marches, soldiers would place bets on which city they were going to fire upon, whether that be New York or Yorktown. The risk was still high for General Washington. Relying on other men for the whole result of the war was unnerving, to say the least, and not only would the French fleet have to show up at precisely the right time, a gamble in itself, but Comte de Grasse would have to fend off the superior British men of war that patrolled the coast and the Chesapeake Bay. However, if this did work, the Continentals could surround Cornwallis and force a victory. The men had been so beaten down these past few years, with only a few victories to tie them on, that a successful siege on a British commander's outpost would surely bring the boys alight with joy. So, they kept marching, and on September 5th, 1781, Cornwallis was startled from his evening dinner as blast erupted from across the Chesapeake Bay. British intelligence had intercepted news that a French fleet was on its way, but no one had ever entertained the idea that it would show up on Cornwallis's back door. In anticipation of an attack in New York, Cornwallis and Admiral Thomas Graves both agreed to send ships that had been previously protecting Cornwallis to New York Harbor. But outrage ran through the commander's blood as he discovered that every ship in the fleet had been sent north. Cornwallis saw the writing on the wall. If the French Navy had come to Chesapeake Bay looking for a fight, then that meant that Washington and his men were soon to follow. Letters went out to Admiral Graves admonishing him for recalling the entire fleet back to his harbor, but Graves relayed back to Yorktown that many of the British ships that had been recalled were already undergoing repairs and could not immediately be dispatched back to Virginia. Cornwallis pounded his fist on the desk in frustration. If the Graves fleet did not return soon, Yorktown would soon be surrounded. Nearly 2 weeks later, on September 18, 1781, Washington and his troops arrived on the outskirts of the port city, their numbers massively bolstered to 17,000 to face off the 9,000 British regulars that lay in wait within the city walls. This is where Washington planned to end the war, if Providence would see him through to it. French troops numbering about 5,500 had made landfall in nearby Gloucester County and were dispatched to the western front of Yorktown with Washington's Continentals on the east. Cornwallis had a chain of 7 redoubts strung around the marshes of the city. Berms of earth fortified with sharpened pine tree trunks and cannon were to be the first targets of the arriving patriots. Washington instructed his troops to start digging a massive line of trenches, edging closer and closer to the British lines without exposing themselves to direct cannon fire. On September 29th, 11 days later, Washington's men got close enough to start inviting British cannon fire. Being almost out of range, the casualties were minimal. The general resolved to get right down into the mud and dirt with his men also lending a hand in the digging process. Every day his men drew closer and closer to the city, taking out redoubts as they worked along. Many men marveled at the sheer bravery or ignorance of Washington, standing time and time again in the line of fire as cannonade erupted all around him. While surveying the trenches, a cannonball landed very near to Washington, and a deafening thunderclap of light and noise as it erupted among its officers. Rochambeau had been knocked from his seat and remained blinded and deaf from the explosion for several seconds after. When his senses finally came back, he realized he had rolled into one of the nearby trenches, dirt and rock still raining down against his back and shoulders. As the smoke cleared away, there was General George Washington, staring through his spyglass as if no sound, light, or explosion had ever occurred. He looked down to his feet where a chaplain's hat lay. Chaplain Evans scrambled up from the ground, astonished at his good fortune. Washington knelt down, retrieved the hat, noticed the singe marks around the brim, and handed it back to the chaplain. "Mr. Evans," he smiled, "you had better take that hat home to show your wife and children." As the trenches grew longer and closer to the city, Continental forces systematically picked off regiments of redcoats stationed at each redoubt. The war outside the city walls proved quite bloody, but the Americans seemed to have the upper hand, both in numbers and in spirit. Time began to pass slowly for the increasingly pressured Cornwallis. Supplies were beginning to wane, and General Graves in New York seemed to have no urgency in returning the British fleet to Yorktown, as he felt repairs should be thoroughly completed before sailing out. Some action had to be taken soon. As mid-October began approaching, as did the Continental Army, Cornwallis made plans to surrender Yorktown, of course, pending his escape. The Chesapeake Bay offered little cover for escape due to a well-lit moon, but finally, the general timed the night for the moon to disappear and take his chance. The moonless night of October 13th, the water of the bay was pitch black, as was everything else. Cornwallis loaded some of his finest officers on a boat to make the first crossing to Gloucester County and flee back to New York. The first boat passed over the waters in complete silence, unmolested by enemy fire or notice. As Cornwallis awaited the return, a massive storm seemed to arise out of nowhere. Sudden winds swept the boats far off course, some capsizing and leaving redcoats fighting to swim back to shore. Lightning flashed and the seas grew deathly chaotic, almost smashing what was left of the returning boats against the coastline rocks. It seemed as though, within a matter of seconds, the calm sea had been ripped apart by violent waves and crashing foam. Cornwallis cursed the sky as his only chance at escape had been foiled. By the next morning, Cornwallis had exhausted his ammunition, instilling an eerie quietness to the front lines. The Americans continued shelling the fortifications relentlessly. He would have to face Washington's conditions if Graves' fleet did not show up soon. On October 13th, General Graves began preparing his navy for departure from New York. The general was almost giddy at the chance to decimate French forces on his preferred battlefield of the sea. That morning, however, another conveniently timed storm swept through New York Harbor. Strong squalls battered the ships in the bay, severely damaging the masts of two of the lead ships, the Shrewsbury and the Alcide. This setback would hinder the British fleet for yet another week, trying once again to repair even more damage. The British Navy was effectively out of commission for the time being, leaving Cornwallis to face the humiliation of surrender. Now, some historians document these two storms as mere coincidence, but if you were to ask any of the patriots, they would have told you that the hand of God was moving against their opponent. And finally, in a painfully shameful last resort, Cornwallis surrendered his 8,000 troops to General George Washington on October 20th, 1781. Embarrassed that the battle-tested British general had been bested by his own former subjects, Cornwallis, in contrast to the normal procedure of displaying defeat, issued his brigadier general to offer the sword of surrender to General Rochambeau. The Frenchman, realizing the slight Cornwallis was trying to give to Washington by not showing up in person, refused it. He pointed to Washington, considering that he had been the chief architect to the plan, but Washington also refused to accept the sword from a lower-ranking officer. He directed the British brigadier to one of his deputies, thereby displaying victory for his troops and the hope of the American experiment. By the time the British fleet arrived, it was far too late. Word was that New York. Word was sent to New York of Yorktown's surrender, but General Graves had already left after finally getting his fleet in order. The general arrived on October 25th, shocked to see that the French fleet had already docked in Chesapeake Bay. Graves looked on in horror as the force he was made aware of was much larger in strength and number than he had originally anticipated. The French Navy officer de Grasse confidently displayed 24 ships out to meet the 19 British men of war in an all-out battle to once again reaffirm hostilities between Great Britain and France. The ships of both fleets lined up, exchanging shot after shot after shot. Cannonballs whistled through the air, splinters of hulls and masts sprayed the faces of the crewmen. All-out war broke out on the water for over 2 hours. The British took heavy losses, with one of the largest ships, the Terrible, sustaining fatal damage to her foremast. The ship was ordered to be sunk as crews could not repair the damage quickly enough out of port. The British, they began distancing themselves from the fleet and started exchanging fire from longer distances, no longer able to face off with the superior French forces. De Grasse chased Graves' men out of the Chesapeake Bay and further away from Yorktown. Eventually, the chase broke off and De Grasse returned. Graves, humiliated, limped his feet his fleet back to New York. As the surrendering ceremonies began, obvious British resentment permeated the formalities. 8,000 British troops marched between the French and American forces. Many men on both sides openly wept, some for joy, some for utter disgust. As British weapons were handed over, some of the regulars simply threw them on the ground, stomping them and attempting to render them useless. As the 8,000 men marched between the columns of victors, the British band keyed a quite appropriate song, "The World Turned Upside Down." "Listen to me, and you shall hear. News hath not been this 1,000 year. Since Herod, Caesar, and many more, you've never heard the like before." The Redcoats would not face the Americans and would only take notice of the French forces. Rochambeau, noticing the disrespect, keyed up his own band, loudly playing an instantly recognizable American classic chorus of Yankee Doodle Dandy. By the time the Americans joined in, the Redcoats could hardly be heard. Washington had done it. He had won the impossible war. He had turned the world upside down. And as we look at this story, we see that the impeccable and unlikely timing of the French fleet, perfectly disguised misinformation, and the heavenly assistance of two very well-timed storms could not have all been simple coincidence. Considering the many stories, several that aren't even mentioned in this video, we can easily see that God had a specific plan for this new world and its people. Once again, as Washington lamented, no people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. Historian Charles Bracelin Floor discovered in his studies that there were at least 67 pivotal moments during the war where miraculous circumstances turned the winds of favor in Washington's direction, allowing the embers of freedom to glow for just one more battle, one more day. And that's what we're asking of you today, our viewers. Your action can be that wind that keeps those embers burning. And with the blessings that we've seen in this story, it's obvious that miraculous things can happen with the right determination and undying dedication required to stave off tyranny. So please, join the National Association for Gun Rights today for just $30 a year so you can stay at the ready with the new marching orders to advance the cause of liberty. Just like the blessings of those that came before us, we'll never see those blessings if we don't decide to stand and fight. I know that this is my call to action. What's yours?